Hello, everyone, and greetings from Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. My name is Deb Harris. I'm the flute professor here at Concordia. I'd like to introduce Doug Harbin. He's professor of theory and composition here at Concordia. And I do want to give a little shout out to Russ Peterson, who is recording us today. There's Russ. Thank you. Today we're going to perform Doug's composition Duo for Flute and Piano. And after our performance, we'll have a interview and kind of a question and answer session. So if you have any questions, our topic today is dealing with commissioning and also the relationship between performer and composer, and also trying to find a composer to commission that's local and maybe somebody you know or a friend. So hopefully you enjoy Doug's Duo Sonata for Flute and Piano. again. I hope you enjoyed our performance of Doug Harbin's duo sonata for flute and piano. And now we'd like to continue with the rest of our presentation entitled Shop Local, Support Your Local Composer. And so we'd like just to give you some ideas about finding composers to commission, also the relationship between the performer and the composer, and some other ideas. So we'll get started. I'd like to ask Doug a few questions. How did you get started as a composer? And could you also just talk a little bit about the piece too?
Sure. So I got started composing really young. I think I was in elementary school and I was taking piano lessons, and the show Major Dad. I don't know if you remember that show. I watched that as a kid, and I liked the theme song, and I don't remember it now, but I remember going to the piano and trying to play it, and then I'd create theme and variations
Cool.
to that song. And so that's where I got started. One thing, I always took piano lessons. My parents were very encouraging with that, but we really didn't know what to do with composition. So one piece of advice I would give is to take composition lessons, to seek out composers in the area. There are composers who teach composition lessons even to young students. And I had a composition professor once say to me, they would expect if you go to college to study composition, you wouldn't go to college to study cello without ever having taken a cello lesson, so why would you go to composition without taking composition
That's a really
lesson?
good point.
So there are people around, so I encourage you to, if you know someone who's interested in composition, do encourage lessons from a young age. Anyway, so when I got to college, I did take composition. I started out as a music education major, decided that wasn't for me, but ended up in education anyway. I've always enjoyed teaching. But my parents were adamant that I not just have a composition degree. They encouraged me to have another degree to fall back on, just in case. So I ended up studying music composition and math, and there are a lot of mathematical complexity.
Yeah, if you all saw the score, you would see what we're talking about. There are times when I feel like I'm supposed to line up with Doug, but that's not what he wrote in the score, and there's all these different mathematical, like 7/6, and so it's very, I think it's a wonderful combination of a math and musical mind coming together.
That is certainly what my goal was. I love the idea of order and chaos, especially when chaotic moments come together and both musicians line up at the right spot and you think, wow, how did they do that? So hopefully that's what we were able to do a little bit in a piece, and one of the things that I was working on. So yeah, I did my undergrad in math and music, and then pursued my master's and my doctorate in music composition. And this piece was written right after I finished my coursework in my doctorate from Arizona State University. And so it was kind of the first piece I wrote about 10 years now, where I didn't have a music composer looking at my work every week and critiquing me. So I was a little nervous to write the piece, and I hope it turned out okay. I'm pretty happy with the end result.
Fabulous.
But it was the original idea was when I was starting my dissertation was to create a synthetic scale of about 9 notes. I think I was playing some chords on the piano one day, and this piece kind of came out of those 9 notes that became their own scale, and that created this piece. So it was interesting about a composer's life. This is a piece that I wrote about a decade ago, but it really never got played for quite some time. Just life happens, a move and working adjunct, and it just made it hard to get the piece performed. And so it was premiered a few years later in New York, actually. And then when I moved and got the job here at Concordia, I met Deb, who was wonderful enough to say, oh, you have a flute piece? I want to play it. And so she's really championed the work.
Well, I'm always looking for new music, so if we have a new composer on staff, I'm right at their door bugging them, what do you have for flute? So I was so happy to discover this piece, and part of performing it for many different venues is trying to get Doug's name out there, and I definitely want to commission Doug to write some more flute music.
I hope to, yes. And a composer's dream is to have performers like Deb. This has just been wonderful to work here and to have her champion the work. We've performed it several times in Finland. We've performed it around Concordia several times, and even in New York. And so I'll let you talk a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, and I want to mention too that we do have a handout that goes along with this presentation, and we have a lot of specifics on places you can look for commissioning, just to get funding for commissioning. And we were accepted last year to perform at the Flute New Music Consortium. And it's a wonderful group, and I would really encourage you to check them out. We have their website listed on the handout. So we went to Stony Brook, where the convention was held in January. It was really great. So in case you don't know about the consortium, it's all member contributions. So many people pay in to have a very famous composer write a piece. And last year's composer was Valerie Coleman. And I'm sure many of you know about Valerie. She was named top 35 female composers in classical music, and she's just really well known. She's getting commissions from many different really big name orchestras, and she's just a fabulous person, flutist and composer. So anyway, last year's guest was Valerie, so we really enjoyed going to the festival, and we interacted with Valerie and went to several of her master classes. And one thing that really struck me about Valerie is that she started composing at a very young age. She started having music lessons at age 11, and by age 14, she had already composed 3 symphonies. And she was in Louisville, and she said, I think being a woman and being a Black woman, she had a lot of struggles for people to take her seriously. But I think one thing that came out through her is that she wrote for her friends. And I think that's how a lot of composers start. And if she couldn't get any serious, groups to play her music, then she got her friends together and they played. And then she learned a lot, she said, by just having her music performed, and she knew, how to write for a different instrument. So I think coming from those beginnings, and she even talked about that when she was in grad school, and she wasn't taking S seriously. But now, and look where she is now. And so it's really a good story for any budding composer, is that you've got to start somewhere and start with your friends, because we always love playing new music. So I think it's a really great story. There was one quote that Valerie said at the festival that I thought was really great, because she's just such a creative. And she said, "Create something new every day, even if it's cooking or just singing in the shower." I just thought that was such a great quote, because just like all of us really need to, even aside from music, we need to just be creative, and that really brings everything together in our music too. So I really love that. So this year's composer, and they do a commissioning every 2 years. So Samuel Zeman is the next composer, and he's writing a piece for 2 flutes. So if you're interested in being involved in that commission, there's still time to be involved in that one. I just bought into that, so I'm really excited to see what he's going to come up with, and that'll be next year. I think it'll be the 2nd year.
Yeah, I'd like to just repeat what Valerie said, because I think it's such great advice about composers. As a composition teacher, I often tell our students, or my students, who do you want to write for? And the best collaborations are when the composer and performer are friends, because the composer knows what the performer can do well and what they can't do well, what makes them sound really good. And the best collaborations occur when that happens. So not to discourage any other collaborations, but I think some of the best collaborations occur with that friendship. So her advice is right on.
Yeah, a great starting point too for someone who's trying to get started. And I would also say to performers, it's really fun working with composers, and every composer is a little different, but even though Doug's piece was finished before I met him, there were a few measures I said, "Oh, Doug, I don't think this works quite so well. Could you change this little thing?" And he was totally open to that. So I think composers like to work with performers to see what's best going to work and make them sound the best and make their piece sound great too. So a lot of composers I've worked with have been very open to, just tweaking things or changing things a little bit.
Absolutely. I think this is jumping ahead a little bit, but one tip I would give performers is don't be afraid to come to the composer and say, "This is really not working for me," or "Could I," come in with ideas, and don't be afraid to say that something isn't working, because we want you to sound the best you possibly can. And so, brainstorming, coming up with a solution is great. And especially if you have ideas. I know at one point you said, "Oh, can we add a harmonic here? That would just work really nice for the color." And I thought, "Oh, what a great idea. I hadn't thought about that." And so having those suggestions might not always work, but at the same time, don't be afraid to throw out those ideas.
And we've been kind of talking just now about more large-scale commissions, but really the heart of our presentation is to try to find local composers. So Doug, could you kind of give us some ideas? Because I think there are more composers out there than we're aware of, and if you could give us some ideas on how you can actually find a composer if you don't have a friend who's a composer.
Right, and so I've been taking the last few months looking around my area, mainly the state of Minnesota, for composers. Kind of been going composer hunting, mainly through the internet, and I've been shocked at how many composers are out there. Part of this started with I volunteered with the Minnesota State Arts Board to go over some grant applications, and I think we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I was shocked at, one, how many schools there are in Minnesota that offer a music program, and two, how many composers there are who aren't necessarily listed as a composer. So I've kind of, my starting point was to look at each institution. Minnesota offers over 30 schools around the state that have a music program, and so I've been looking at the faculty that they post in their bios. And most every school has at least one composer, if not many. I know Concordia College, we have about 5 composers on faculty, even though only about 2 or 3 of us are listed technically as composers or that teach composition. So many are performers who also compose. And so I know that this might not seem intuitive, it might not feel like there's, that you have a big music school in your area, but give it a shot. I think you might be surprised that even some of the small towns in Minnesota, these smaller schools, there are remarkable composers that are living and doing work. And so that would be one thing, look at academic institutions in your area. But also, I know several composers, some of our students at Concordia who might have an interest in composition but are music ed majors, go off and teach at high schools and junior highs and elementary schools, but also compose. And so look at the local areas and go to local events. I think we all support our local arts organizations, and this is just another reason to do so. You might find that they'll be producing or performing a work by a local composer. One other thing that I thought was really interesting is I just decided to look and type in my town, Moorhead, Minnesota, type in Moorhead composer. And immediately my name popped up, which was nice and humbling, but also Russ Peterson, who did our recording, as well as a composer at Minnesota State University Moorhead, as well as many other names. So that could be a quick way of finding some composers that are in the area.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a word about Russ. We've been friends for a long time and performing together for a long time, and I think in 2009, he and I and Jay Hirschberger, the pianist, just decided that we really loved performing together. It was flute, sax, and piano, and there wasn't really that much repertoire at that point. So Russ, just out of necessity for our group, started composing for us. So if you want to Google Excelsior Trio, you can see some pieces that Russ has written for us. And the other thing I wanted to mention too, you can always arrange pieces. So if there's a composer you really like, that you don't have that instrumentation, or there's somebody you just really would love to play with, that's another option too. And both Doug and I would like to take this opportunity right now to encourage you to reach out to find composers of color, Black composers, female composers, and let's try to find new music by composers who are underrepresented. And I think that would be a wonderful kind of way to start your journey on finding a composer too.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to jump on your point about arranging because I know several composers. I think Jim Stevenson, for example, is a great trumpet player and got his start as a composer by just arranging. And don't be afraid to compose yourself and arrange and get advice from others. And that's a wonderful way to, if you're a composer yourself, that's even better.
Right.
So I guess the next question is, if you find a composer, and a tip that we were going to say later, but I think it deserves to be said now, is you want to make sure that you've done some research and that the composer fits your style or something that you want. Not every composer, just like a relationship, not everybody's right for anyone. Same thing with composers. They might compose in a style that you don't really enjoy, and I don't think it's advantageous to ask a composer to do something that they really don't do very well, or that isn't anybody's cup of tea. So finding that right relationship is really important. But let's say you found a composer that you're really interested in. the next thing is that commission and funding it. So maybe you have some ideas about talking about ways to fund a commission.
Right, so of course we're in western Minnesota, so we definitely have our sources in town. There's one group that's actually in Fargo but serves the Fargo-Moorhead area that's called the Arts Partnership, and it's kind of an umbrella organization for the arts, and I've gotten funding from them before. So, you know, if you live in Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota, any state, just try to seek out these groups, because there are plenty of arts funding organizations now. Of course, in the time of COVID, funding might be not what it normally is, but we feel like it's going to get back to that place. And I think we've all can agree during this quarantine that we need arts and we need music in our life. So I think we're hoping that these arts organizations will survive and flourish and encourage, you know, more writing. So also the state of Minnesota, you looked up, has 10 or
Over
11
regions.
Region arts councils. We're in Lake Region Arts Council, but there are many throughout the state, and I'm sure other states, Wisconsin or any other states, have their own regional arts councils too that you can apply for. And I thought, since Doug's been on some committees, I thought our panels for reviewing, I thought maybe, and then, oh, before I go on, I wanted to say that we have a lot of information on our handout that's more specific and specific websites you can check out. But I thought it'd be fun to hear from Doug if he has any advice for writing a grant. And I think the biggest thing on a grant is, how do you make your grant stand out to the granting committee, because there are probably a lot of other people who are asking for money too. So if you could maybe speak to that a little bit, that'd be great.
Yeah, I had the distinct pleasure to work for the Minnesota State Arts Board on 2 separate occasions for their Artist Initiative grant, which offers up to $10,000 for an artist of their, you know, it could be all for them, but it's a really interesting grant and something that, you know, grants can seem like they are overwhelming, but one thing, or that they're only for big organizations or these top-notch players, but that's really not true, especially in Minnesota. So the first thing I'd like to say is that the Minnesota State Arts Board, and I'm sure every state is similar, has a bunch of wonderful people working for them who are happy to help. So I know Minnesota State Arts Board has people, if you call in, you can meet one-on-one with a person and they will help you write your grant application. So there is help. I would say that would be my first bit of advice, is to seek that help. And again, they are wanting to help all people. So it doesn't matter where you are in your career. They actually really want to help underrepresented people of all sorts. So that could be people living not in the Twin Cities. That could mean people of color. It could mean, you know, whatever it might be.
Like an emerging artist.
Yes, and they actually want people from all stages of the career. So for the Minnesota State Arts Board, I thought I'd tell you the 3 components that they evaluate. The first one is artistic quality, meaning that they are not asking for you to be the best performer in the world. They're looking at where you are in your career. So like you were saying, it is available for people who are just starting out in their career, or to people who are well advanced in their career. The big point is that they want the grant to push you further, one step further. So if you're starting out in your career, that would look very different than if you are advanced in your career. So that is the first thing. The second component is merit and feasibility. So it's, would this project actually occur? And so you would want to do your research, get the right amount of time, the amount of time it would take, the amount of money it would take for the commission. And so it's important that you've done your research and those kind of things first. The last thing, and it's probably the most important aspect, especially these days, is the community engagement component. This is something that they've increased the importance of lately with the Minnesota State Arts Board, and now it is equal with the other 2 components. And so this one is, how does this project benefit your community in a way that community won't necessarily, that doesn't really have those opportunities right now. So again, this is a chance to really boast. If you are producing a work by an underrepresented composer, this is a time to really boast about that, and I think really helps opportunities in that way. So those are the 3 areas that the committee judges on, evaluates, and so if you can think about that, and especially in the commissioning process, if you say, I have a if there's a point to the commission that really speaks to the community that you are in, I think that goes well with the shop local and also for these grant possibilities.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, what else do we have to talk about?
Well, I know that you've been working with a lot of composers, not just me, but you mentioned Russ, and so I thought it might be interesting for you to talk a little bit about tips, advice that you have as a performer that when you've worked with composers in the past.
Yeah, I think one thing Doug mentioned before is don't be afraid to reach out to the composer and work in a collaborative way and say, hey, what would you think about this? It's not like you're changing the whole piece, but maybe one note or one measure, might be easier on your instrument. Not even easier, but make the music flow better or something like that. And we're really fortunate here at Concordia because we do have 3 composers on staff that are listed as composers, and then we have Russ, and we have another pianist, Grigor Kachtorian. So we have a lot of composers around, so students are writing a lot of music here, which is very exciting. So sometimes my flute students will bring music for me to help them with when they're going to do a performance of a student composer work. And I think that's a really ideal opportunity to collaborate because they're on the same level, both students, and they want to help each other out. The flute players want to play, the composers want to write, so it's a perfect kind of marriage. But one thing I see for young composers, especially for wind writing and flute writing, is that I think they really struggle with writing articulation. So that's one thing I think it's easy to really work with a composer and say, hey, how do you want this all tongued if they just write single notes, or so I think that's one way we can really concretely help a composer, especially a young composer. I mean, I wouldn't say that to Doug because he knows what he's doing, but for a young composer.
Well, still, yeah, I think that's really important. As someone who works with a lot of really young composers, a lot of times they don't know what articulation they want. And so it can be very helpful, especially for a young composer, to say, could I play it like this? Or let me try playing it like this, and let them hear 3 different ways or 4 different ways to perform a passage. And usually the composer has some idea of what they want, and maybe it'll take them, each composer is different. So sometimes they might have a real strong opinion. Others, they might say, well, do whatever feels best for you, some are laid back. But, letting them hear that, I think, is a really good experience for those young composers. But you're absolutely right that sometimes articulations can be a little tricky, and I think that's something that as you write more as a composer for a certain instrument, you start knowing exactly what you want. So it kind of depends on the experience of the composer.
And it kind of reminds me back to Valerie's comment about her first writing for her friends, and that's just such a great collaboration because then she learned what works for different instruments, and maybe this trill is really hard. Like we have some trills on the flute, of course, that aren't very easily done, and we could say, hey, could you make it just a little different trill, or something like that. So it was fun to hear Valerie Coleman say that's how she got her start. And we really want to encourage musicians and flutists to seek out composers, but we'd also like to encourage you all to maybe try your hand at composing too. My secret, deep dark secret that I'm now going to say in public is I've kind of been thinking about it myself. So maybe one of these days I'll be brave and start to put some things down. So we'll see.
I'm encouraging her. Yes.
I think, is that about all we have to say?
Well, did you want to talk about commissioning? Have you dealt with commissioning fees and things like that?
Yeah, well, so I mentioned the Flute New Music Consortium, so that's a way to get a really big name composer because the fees are quite expensive. And also within our group Excelsior Trio, so flute, sax, and piano isn't like the most common chamber music group, but we've actually collaborated with other flute, sax, and piano groups. So sometimes you can do like a niche thing of what your group is, or what if you have flute and oboe, maybe you could find other flute and oboe duos and go together and each can put in a smaller amount of money to make for a bigger commission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know on the handout I listed a couple of links. I thought I'd just real quickly talk a little bit about those. That commissioning rates are very interesting for composers. It really varies, and I think it really depends on who you're working with as far as the commissioning rate is concerned. I included a link from, I think it's New Music Box, that gives a calculator for how much you should pay a composer. And I would like to state that is a source. It is not a definitive source, in my opinion. I think it really depends if you're writing for Libby Larson or asking Libby Larson for a commission versus a student, obviously there's going to be a very big difference on the fee. And so I think it's important to talk to the composer, and a lot of times the composer won't know either. I think a lot of times, I can speak personally, I'm more just wanting to work with somebody, and it's less about the money for me personally. For other composers, it might be more about the money, but I think many times it's more about the experience and having a good collaboration. And so I think don't let that be a stopping point. Again, there are these grant opportunities for commissioning rates, but talk with the composer, and I'm sure that there's some agreement that can be settled. I know one composer, Mark Applebaum, out in California, has a brilliant system where he says he also has these call for commissions where people will pay a little bit, but his thing is if you perform it 10 times, you don't have to pay anything, and it depends on how many performances you give. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but something like that, where it depends on how many times you perform it, that depends on how much you would pay, and the more you perform, the less you have to pay. So that's kind of a brilliant marketing system.
I was going to say also on that, we were accepted this year to perform Doug's piece at the National Flute Convention. Of course, it's not happening due to COVID. We are invited next year to Washington, D.C., so hopefully we can go there. But I wanted to say to flute players, when you find a composer that you really believe in, try to get as many performances of the piece, and that way it might even give someone the idea, like maybe a trombone player or a band director, oh, I want a piece by this guy too, because I really like his music. So I've been so happy to try to champion Doug's music, because I just think he has a lot to say, and I love the way he writes for flute. So hopefully there are going to be more. He did actually write a piece last year for a special art event where he wrote for, I have a contrabass flute, so he wrote for contrabass, and our good friend Sonia Bosca Harrison plays viola and electronics. So we premiered that last year, and we actually got that accepted to be performed at the
College Music Society.
CMS convention, which of course is now going to be online. So we'll be playing that, we'll be recording that later. So I think it's really important for us as performers to also champion composers and give them their voice, and so then they can have other connections and collaborations with other people too.
Yeah, because as a composer, money is one thing, and yes, some composers who are, especially those who are freelancing, they need that to survive. But composers, having more performances and recordings and more exposure is also very, very valuable. So thank you to Deb for that.
Sure. Well, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about today? So we recorded both the performance, and then this is recorded, obviously. So if you have any questions, we'll be hanging out there, and we'd love to hear from you and answer your own personal questions. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much for listening tonight, and hopefully we'll see you soon.